Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the series of Zoominars on theories of regulation. And today with us, Professor Stefano Ponte from the Copenhagen Business Schools, who will talk about business power and sustainability. Let me introduce him formally. Beyond his affiliation with the CBS, is interested in transnational economic and environmental governance, with focus on overlaps and tensions between private authority and public regulation. His research, fieldwork, teaching, and policy work is informed by international political economy approaches, the global value chain analysis, and convention theory. Stefano is also analyzed business, government, civil society interaction especially in Africa and in the global South. Is particularly interested in how sustainability labels, certification, and codes of conduct shape power relations in global value chains, and how different forms of partnerships affect sustainability outcomes. He's working on major projects, critically examining the role of celebrities and branding in these processes. He works on new forms of development aid, on changing corporate social and environmental responsibility practice, and cause-related marketing. He's currently the director of the Center for Business and Development Studies at the CBS. So Stefano, welcome to the series. Thank you very much for joining us and presenting your work, and you're most welcome to present.
Thank you, David. Well, thank you very much, David, and thanks for the invitation to present at this webinar series on theories of regulation and governance. I will present some material from my book, Business Power and Sustainability today, with a specific angle on issues related to regulation and governance, and in particular, regarding discussions on orchestration, okay? So that's out of the whole book. I will focus especially on material that comes out from 2 chapters. Here you have the table of contents of the book. The book was something that I started working in 1718 when I was on research leave at Duke University, and it came out of a sort of a midlife crisis that is professional, in a sense that I've been working on this stuff for 20 years. And I've been working on issues related to transnational environmental governance, to global value chains, the organization of the global economy. And I was trying to make sense of how the two spoke to each other, because essentially, you know, especially in the past 10, 15 years, I've been speaking to 2 separate audiences. One is the part of the audience that is here today, interested in regulation and governance, sustainability governance, transnational environmental governance, etc. And the other one really is global production networks, global value chains. And I was trying to figure out a way in which I could reflect upon the work that I did in these 20 years in ways that could bring together these insights in order to advance the both fields. So this is the result of that effort. And so today I'll be actually, even though this audience is interested in sustainability governance, I will speak mostly about this chapter 5, orchestrating sustainability, although I will draw from the other chapters in order to provide you a background of why I came into looking at orchestration, and therefore issues of regulation and governance in that particular way. So my presentation is organized in 4 sections. Right away, I will be telling you what the key questions were behind the sort of intellectual stimulus for the work and the book, what empirical basis I used to address those questions, and then the theoretical framework that I laid out to answer those questions. I will have a very short discussion of the main findings, and then I will move on directly to issues related with orchestration, and then a reflection and a short sort of reflection also on a future research agenda that I can see this work could be going also in collaboration with any of the people who are part of this network as well, because it entails work that is a bit bigger than what I was able to do for this book. So let me move on to the first part. So part one of the presentation is, let me start with the research questions and the questions, the intellectual questions in general that really spurred my interest to carry out this work. One is I'm at Copenhagen Business School. I'm in a business school environment, but essentially our business school is a university that is interested in business-related issues, but we cover most of the social sciences and some humanities. So we go from traditional, more traditional business school departments that have to do with economics, finance, operations management, strategy, and all the way into politics, communication, philosophy, and sociology as applied to organization. So it's a bit of a strange place, which gives us a lot of freedom to actually understand the relations between business, regulators, and activism in ways that I found much more difficult in monodisciplinary environments. So the starting point, though, was a question of, is sustainability becoming important for business in the world of global value chains? And world of global value chains is essentially an observation that global value chains are the main instruments and organizational tool of organizing the global economy. It has become in the past 20 years. And if it's becoming so more important, why? And how do we find out? That was the original sort of push from an intellectual perspective and a curiosity perspective. And that came out of the fact that when I started doing this work 20 years ago, I would go and interview people in international corporations or international traders. I've done a lot of work on agri-food sort of value chains, especially from Africa, but also from other parts of the global south. And you would find the usual things. Oh yeah, sure, we have the CSR office. It's just around the corner in a small office close to HR. So it means it's not really strategically important. We do it because maybe we were exposed in the media for something that happened, or because maybe our shareholders are saying, well, maybe for risk purposes, we should have something like that. But it wasn't really serious. And the work that I've done, especially in the last 10 years, in particular the last half decade, I've noticed a major change in terms of the importance of sustainability issues. Sustainability has entered the boardroom, has entered the CEO office, the CFO office. It's really a key preoccupation and also a key strategic tool that business is using. So we need to reflect upon that when we talk about regulation and governance, because also the attitude and the experience of the business has changed in relation to sustainability. The second question, or set of questions, is business helping to solve global sustainability crisis? How, if any, and to what extent? In that case, who wins, who loses? So issues of distribution, issues of inequality, issues of, are we really addressing the actual environmental or social problems that are arising? A parenthesis here, the book is mostly on environmental sustainability, not because social sustainability is less important, it's just I had to make a decision because with one book, I couldn't really cover everything. So what we're talking about today is mostly environmental sustainability. And the book is about that. The third set of questions that, and one that I highlight a bit more in this presentation, is what is the role of orchestration by public authorities at the international, regional, and national level in the context of this world that is changing, is organizing on value chains, and where sustainability is becoming more mainstream. So that's a sort of the origins of why I went down this way with this particular approach in the book. So the empirical basis that I drew for the book are essentially my own work with some addition. Most of the work I did and have done in the past, but also now, is on agri-food value chains. And for this book, I worked on wine, coffee, and biofuels. I guess I like liquid forms in terms of consumption. I do like wine and coffee. I was into biofuels before electric vehicles became a much better way doing alternative sustainability for transport, and even that public transport, of course, is much better than that. In any case, I have also worked in other industries, but these are the three that I am leveraging in the book to try to explain, to address those questions. In the past decade, I also worked with the colleagues here at the Copenhagen Business School and other places on capital-intensive value chains with mobile assets. I'm talking about shipping and aviation here. They're very interesting when it comes to GHG emission negotiations and regulation. As you have probably figured out, that there's been a lot of controversy. And so in particular for the presentation today, I will draw a good bit from the empirics that come from those two sectors, although I will not go into detail in the presentation. If you're interested, of course, you should look it up in the book or write to me and I'll send you some material. I'm also drawing in the book from existing research on labor-intensive value chain, especially in apparel and furniture. I was involved in some of the work in furniture. So this is essentially what the empirics that are framing the analysis in the book. Now, in terms of analytical framework, so I draw from sustainability governance, in particular transnational sustainability governance approaches, but then in collaboration and in integrated with issues that have to do with the governance of global value chains, how they are organized, who governs them, what are the power relations along them, trying to understand the role of business, but also of other stakeholders, like multi-stakeholder initiatives or NGOs, consumer groups, and all of that, in shaping the way in which sustainability is handled, and to what extent that those kind of concerns are also shaping the outcomes that are related to these interactions. So essentially the theoretical framework that I used is a theory of power in global value chains that essentially puts interactions in these value chains into four overlapping, historically contingent, always changing categories. So this is not an assignment, one or another kind of exercise, but to try to understand different mechanisms. And the two by two are this theory of power in global value chains is arranged around two axes. One is the transmission mechanisms, and you can see that over here, that can be direct and diffuse. On one end of the spectrum are circumstances in which value chain actors, either individually or collectively, seek to exert form of influence over other actors and other groups. Actors can clearly identify each other, and their actions are intentional and goal-oriented. So in such cases, transmission mechanisms tend to be formal and explicit and can be quite specific. On the other end of the spectrum, towards the diffuse, we have more diffuse forms of power in which actors, collectives, or collective of actors, and the object of power may be less clearly identifiable and actions less intentional. Now, on the other side, the transmission mechanisms for diffuse power can be imprecise, such as those emerging from social movements or the propagation of new managerial models. So this is this act. The second one has to do with the arena of actors. So the arena of actors that indicates a set of actors or collectives that are directly or indirectly engaged in the process of global value chain governance. And so we have a dyadic group. So this is essentially about firm-to-firm relations or individual firm-to-state agency relations, for example. And the other one is collective. It's about the interactions that go in between business associations, for example, and large NGO groups or something of that sort. Putting these together, by the way, this is a typology that we developed with Mark Dallas and Tim Sturgeon, came out in Review of International Political Economy in 2019, as I indicate down here. So if we put them together, we have four kinds of power. So we have direct and dyadic power, okay? And that is, we call it bargaining power. Most of the work in business school scholarship and also in international political economy work on global value chains of a certain kind is actually about bargaining power. So firm-to-firm relations, and depending on what kind of coordination is taking place, then there are different kinds of transmissions of dynamics of power. So we go and count how many buyers there are, how many sellers there are, what kind of market power they have. And, you know, it's a sort of a fairly mainstream kind of concern with firm-to-firm interaction. If we go down one, so we go institutional power is direct, but is collective. Here's where much of the regulation and governance, sort of political economy, international political economy, literature is concerned. So it's concerned with government regulation, with multi-stakeholder initiatives, with associational rules in, say, business associations. And it looks at also standards and codified best practices that are set up through these interactions in collective sphere. Now, when we go on the diffuse side, we have diffuse and dyadic. We call it demonstrative power. So here we look at the informal transmission mechanisms along value chains. We talk about discourses, expectations, demonstration effects, competitive mimicry, including quality conventions that are implicitly accepted by the parties of a dyadic transaction, which they are not necessarily explicitly agreed to, but they're implicitly accepted as being common to the transaction. So a lot of sociology insights are coming into that. And finally, we have constitutive power, which is diffuse but collective. And here we talk about power that is transmitted through broadly accepted norms, conventions, expectations, and best practices that are not limited to the one-to-one dyadic interaction, but they are percolating through economy and society. So this includes legitimation processes and, for example, support from social and consumer movements. Some of the regulation and governance literature has started to work on this as well. So for me, it was a way of putting together analysis of power that otherwise they take it implicitly that they are working on one or more of these kinds without necessarily explicitating, explaining what kind of power we're talking about and how it comes together. So that was a starting point of the theoretical framework for the book. And then I applied that to these case studies that I indicated earlier. I'm just going to give you a very quick insight on one case study. I will not explain all the dynamics, just to give you a flavor of the kind of work that you will find in the book if you're interested in. And this is the work on, need to change something here, okay. On coffee. So I've been working on coffee for 20 plus years, and this kind of graphic representation is essentially a summary of one of the case studies. And what I'm trying to do here is to do an analysis of power and governance in this global value chain that brings in the different kinds of power and looks at it in an evolutionary way. So I have 2 time periods here, and I do this for all the other case studies as well, and then try to understand what's happening in each time period to relations of power read through the different kinds of power. And then I try to figure out what is happening that is important and where it takes place in order for a switch of the power balances as they have happened between the two periods. In this particular case, for example, demonstrative power is important and institutional power is important. And then there is a whole series of discussions here about what happened. And these blocks on the right-hand side tell you how important was ideas and practices on sustainability in order for us to understand why that change of power took place, okay? I don't want to go into more detail than this. Also, the coffee case study alone would, require me like another 40 minutes just to unpack that. But just to give you a flavor of the kind of work that went behind that, and it's work again. It is a global value chain work. It is about the relations of power. It is about sustainability. But I didn't want to leave it at that, because then I would have essentially left a big gap in terms of understanding what other work on, say, orchestration and in sustainability governance, how it could come in more explicitly, even though I do reflect on it in some of these boxes. Okay. And I think I've used about 15 minutes so far. Is that correct?
About 20.
Okay, good. I'm just on track then. Okay, next. All right. So if you trust me that I've done that for these three cases, and then let me tell you what the big story that is coming out of really detailed empirical work that took me about 20 years to do in these three sectors in particular. And the main findings are summarized by 4 words. I was told by our communication offices here that you really need to have a one-liner for everything. You know, we are the business school after all, and we don't have many floors to go up with a lift, and so it has to be really quick because it's only 2 floors. And so the argument is, the main finding is green capital, brown environment. And let me tell you what it means, okay? So the first main finding is that sustainability has become key in understanding contemporary capitalism and therefore global value chain. Sustainability is becoming and has become in many cases mainstream in business, in regulation, and all the interactions that are in between. The second point here is that, say 15 years ago, when I joined, no, 10 years ago, when I joined the business school, it was all about what is the business case for sustainability. If there's no business case, then it's not gonna work. And because of new technologies, because of a lot of regulatory pressure, because of consumer taste changes, essentially, in most cases, there is a business case for sustainability, or if there isn't, it can be solved quite easily with organizational, technical, and technological change and some sort of innovation. So the discussion is not whether there's a business case, but how then business can take advantage of sustainability. And I use that verb quite purposefully of sustainability, and you'll understand why in a second. Second broad set of findings is that lead firms in global value chains, we're talking about the IKEAs of the world, the McDonald's of the world, the Nestle's of the world, Walmart, H&M, you name it. Those who drive, those who govern global value chains, they've been able to leverage sustainability to maximize what I call green capital accumulation, okay? And they do that by creating and capturing new value through sustainability management. They diversify their portfolio of goods, including greener goods and services. They use sustainability to minimize reputational risk and therefore being careful about not having impacts on their reputation that may have a big impact, for example, in their market valuation if they are quoted in the stock market. And also to soften regulatory demands. If they can show that they can deliver sustainability without being regulated, then they would go into a lobbying situation and say, hey, we're doing it already. Why are you wasting your time trying to regulate something that we are self-regulating? Of course, the story is much different than that. But of course, that is from an insider perspective, what and how sustainability has been used and is being used to ensure green capital accumulation. So it's not just capital accumulation, but green capital. Capital is becoming greener, and the whole point is to accumulate capital rather than greening the world. And that leads me to the third point, which is the point on brown environment and of inequality. This is all taking place, green capital accumulation in the global north or large multinationals in the global south. But for lead firms in global value chains, in any case, it's taking place at the cost of suppliers. Most of the suppliers are based in the global south and with limited or no impact on the environment. So there's a lot of actions that have been taken by business through multi-stakeholder initiatives or internal code of conduct, certifications, you name it, to address sustainability. But that is for green capital accumulation purposes because the focus is not on actually measuring whether they make a difference on the environment, but to signal that they are apparently taking care of it. So this is the brown environments bit. So either we don't know whether there is an impact or is quite limited, or there is actually a negative impact on the environment. This is happening also in terms of inequality impacts through what I call the sustainability supplier squeeze. Essentially, big buyers in global value chains are asking their suppliers to deliver extra sustainability content without paying extra money for it, even though it may actually be delivered with higher cost, or with short-term higher cost that may lead to some improvements in efficiency from suppliers who could actually gain in the long term, but also in the context of a lot more competition with other suppliers. And therefore, I call this, that is not only mainstreaming of sustainability, there's a mainstreaming. It is becoming acceptable to extract value from your suppliers to deliver sustainability. And that is a very big change that has happened, especially in the past decade. And you can find a lot of that in the book. Now, I'm gonna go on now and talk to something that's about closer to the interest of this audience, and definitely of David, because he's been part of this long conversation on orchestration and on the orchestrator intermediary target of regulation model, now called the OIT, now called RIT, because orchestration become regulator. In any case, I don't have time to cover all that debate, but essentially I will give you an insight on how I used those really important insights in my book with a twist, okay? For me, in the way that I applied orchestration means national and international public organizations using different combinations of indirect tools like intermediation and delegation, as this is the classic sort of 2x2 or modes of governance. There's nothing new here. And directing regulatory tools, regulatory threats, or incentives that are usually classified as hierarchy or collaboration, depending on whether they are hard or soft. Here I put intermediation, even though in the original model in 2015, it said orchestration here. It was, I think it was confusing. Intermediation is actually what is meant here. It's indirect and soft mode of governance. And the way that I see orchestration is the way in which these are matched them, that are overlapping, or different tools from different boxes are put together by the orchestrators, in this particular case, orchestration by public organizations, okay? Including threat of regulation, so the whole discussion of gorilla in the closet, which has been in the literature for a while. And also insights from network formation and management. We, with Lasse Folke Henriksen, who's a sociologist here at CBS, we also published a paper in these terms in Regulation and Governance a few years ago. So if we look at the literature, so what are the factors that can shape the success of sustainability orchestration? So we have a model of success factors for international organizations, so a particular set of actors from Abbott et al., the book on orchestration. And these are the sort of the four main variables they propose, plus two that are particularly specific to specific IOs. Now, in work that I did with Jane Lisser and others a few years back, we actually developed a set of alternative, partially alternative factors that we applied to understand orchestration at the regional and national level. Please, though, it isn't about orchestration nationally or regionally, but it is national and regional authorities that through orchestration try to make a difference transnationally. In particular, in the case that we worked on aviation and shipping in terms of shaping GHG emissions. So in the book, what I said was like, okay, well, let's try it out. So the first step that I did is that I applied these two models to aviation and shipping. These are two capital intensive value chains. They have mobile assets, so it's very, very difficult to orchestrate. You can also register ships in, registers of convenience, as you all know. Both of them are relatively important systemic polluters in terms of they account for 2-3% of global GHG emissions, with quite high growth in both cases, even though, of course, what's happened with COVID in the last few years on the side of aviation has slowed down that, but there's no sign that in the long term is going to change. Importantly, they have a similar governance system in the value chain. And so what I did was to score the expected and outer outcomes of orchestration by international organization in aviation and shipping. Here you have essentially the model the expectations that we would have according to the Abbott et al. Model. So if, for example, you would have low orchestration if you have these indicators scoring like that. Essentially, in both cases, you have very low levels of international organization orchestration, at least until very recently. For aviation has changed a little bit. Even shipping is trying, but not very convincingly. So by looking at this score, what I figured out is like, okay, well, this model is pretty okay. I mean, you got 5 of these that meet the expectations. The other 2 don't, but that's okay. On the other hand, I only have observations in which orchestration didn't take place. So what I did the same exercise then to the other 3 case studies that I have, and I'll come to that in a second. At the same time, because of low orchestration, it means that whatever orchestration is taking place is actually taking place through, and you see in the second thing here, in the second table, by national governments and the EU in these particular cases. So we applied the model Lister and Al model to try to understand whether actually those variables would be predictable in terms of the expectations. And so we did the same thing here. This is the model, expectation low. These are the scoring. And then we looked at what happened in shipping, where orchestration of the national or regional governments in any case didn't help, and its orchestration is low even at that level. But in aviation, actually, there was quite a good bit going on both in the EU and the US. And so there was a level of actual orchestration that was taking place. So we ranked these and we saw, well, these 3 variables here, combination of efforts, issue visibility, interest alignment, are fairly good at explaining why we're having these outcomes. Regulatory uncertainty, not so much. So then we use that model to then score what is going on in wine, coffee, and biofuels at the national and regional level. And essentially, it's the same exercise, only that in this area, instead of having shipping and aviation, we have the 3 value chains that I looked into more detail in the book. And the result is that combinatory efforts and issue visibility are strongly predict the outcomes that we are observing. Interest alignment, and somewhat, not always, but regulatory uncertainty is a bit more messy, so it doesn't really explain too much. I'll come back to this in the future research agenda, because of course this is only the start of of analysis that needs to be done in many more actors with many more factors, and I'll come back to that in a second. The last step was to link GVC governance, power, and orchestration. So this is the final thing where I was trying to put it all together. So, and you find a much more detailed explanation in the book. What I was looking at was changes in global value chain governance between the 2 periods that we were looking at in these 3, the kinds of power that were instrumental in making that change happen, who were the key public orchestrators, okay? And then what are the pressure points for orchestration? So where was it that change took place, and who put the pressure points for that change? And then this is just a rehashing of the current level of orchestration effort, as I showed you earlier. I'm not so interested in the results here, but to show you the kind of thinking is behind this kind of work. So you don't have to read this, but the way in which this can then be used for policy-oriented or activist action is as follows. So if, as we saw before, the 3 variables of combinatory efforts and issue visibilities, of course, are quite important to some extent under interest alignment, then we can go, then we can go in each of the 3 of the value chains and try to understand how do we go from low to high here, and therefore what is needed and what kind of power needs to be imparted, because there's no point in trying to impart regulatory power if what is needed is, say, constitutive power. So it's a completely different entry point to try to shape and orchestrate change. I'll leave it at that for now, because I really just wanted to give you a sense of what this can lead to if applied carefully. What I want to do in the last few minutes I have, David, can I take 3-4 minutes?
Yes, you can, please.
Okay. So a set of general reflections is that the potential for orchestration to enhance sustainability really depends on the governance and power dynamics of the relevant value chains. And so you really need to understand the value chain or an industry or a particular market in order to apply a regulatory factor. So there isn't, and we shouldn't seek a general model of orchestration because it really depends on the actual situation in the value chain. The second point is that leverage points, both regulatory, but also activism, NGO, media exposure, you name it, consumer activism, they tend to work better in value chains that are led by global bias, these lead firms that I listed before, because they have a lot invested in their brands, and because they, in their great size and power, they also have vulnerabilities that can be used to make change, and they have been used to make some change, and therefore this is one of the areas in which certain kinds of orchestration that I showed you earlier can work. However, this is a point 3. So in point 2, what it means is that these industries or companies or brands are very visible to the political system, to voters, to consumers, to local constituents, okay? When that is not the case, so in more invisible global value chains, like biofuels, at least in certain periods, like say fertilizer or coal or other non-branded, mass bulk products, public regulatory approaches and much more directive orchestration is needed, because otherwise you can't change things because there isn't enough visibility. So if there are 2 points that are, I think, applicable generally, there is the need of both direct and indirect orchestration tools. So neither only regulation nor business self-regulation will work. And the second point is that enhancing issue visibility in whatever way can be done, depending on the value chain, is key, if that is key. So I want to leave you with a reflection about where this kind of work can be taken in the future. And I said, I'm also interested in collaborating with anyone who's interested in this. Of course, I applied this to sort of 3 case studies in depth, and other 2 in terms of the sequencing that I was doing for orchestration. So it really is a particular picture of a set of industries that needs to be applied in other places. I know there are a lot of people working on orchestration, but this combination of the value chain, governance, and power on one side, orchestration on the other, hasn't been used yet. Second is I need to do more work in terms of unpacking combinatory efforts. So what combinations of what work in which cases? What kind of visibility? Is it consumers? Is it political visibility? Different kinds of visibilities. What kind of alignment of interest? This was very complicated in some of the case studies, because you may have alignment between a regulator and business in one particular region, but then disalignment in another region, or you may have even disalignment along the value chain. And so that needs to be refined. Same story with regulatory uncertainty. There are many different ways in which we can take that forward. In the book, I took one particular view on uncertainty, but there are certainly others. One could explore other independent variables, also analyze other sequencing and overlaps. So I took 2 cases in which international organizations weren't very successful in organizing, in orchestrating, and then I went to the national regional level to see what transnational impacts they had. We need to look at other combinations of this sequencing as well. And finally, deepen the theoretical links rather than just empirical analysis between governance and power and global value chains on one hand, and orchestration dynamics and outcomes on the other. And with that, I will stop right here. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Stefano. And now it's time for question and from the audience. So please come in, and you're most welcome to ask. Who wants to go first? Just I see Edwin ends up there. So Edwin, you're first. Just present yourself as well, and open your audio and video. So please, Edwin, please.
Oh, well, I might have a question. I didn't raise my hand or something. I did the question, but I did the clapping thing. But that's fine. I do have a question. So maybe to introduce myself quickly, my name is Edwin. I'm a PhD in University College Dublin in environmental law and governance. I find the work really interesting, and also especially the standards, setting standards and how that sort of changes the behavior of these companies. And one thing that I would like maybe to hear your ideas on is something that I've been seeing more recently. It's where big firms like dairy firms in my country, the Netherlands, dairy firms, supermarkets have been putting sort of things on their packaging that says voted by the consumers as most sustainable dairy firm, most sustainable supermarket. And I always think the consumers know very little of how sustainable these, they probably know the least of how sustainable these firms are. And I find it very interesting as sort of orchestrating the other way around, that you're sort of telling the consumers, you think that we are sustainable, and yeah, it sort of goes the other way around again. And I just was wondering if you might have seen similar things or what your ideas on this issue. Thanks.
We take a few more and then we'll do by round.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. So Marcus second and Maria third.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefano. That was very, very interesting indeed. I wondered if you could point out, or if you know of any industries where the danger or the result of orchestration has not been inflicting more pain on the suppliers in the global south.
Yeah, thank you. And Maria?
Hi, thank you very much, Stefano. My name is Maria Weimer. I am Associate Professor of Law at the Amsterdam Law School and also a member of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. And I have recently began a project on European regulation of sustainable supply chains, in particular in the field of deforestation, so the EU's efforts to create a new regulatory framework to fight deforestation, and with an emphasis on agricultural supply chains. And I find your work truly fascinating. I think you're also expected, or you were expected before Corona, to come and visit us and give some lectures. So I hope this is still going to happen. My questions are perhaps rather basic. I'm interested in understanding, firstly, if you speak about the global economies or the business potential to solve environmental crisis, what is your approach to measuring to what extent these efforts have had environmental impact? So how do you approach the sort of empirical issue of actually measuring what kind of initiatives have made a difference, and also what's the time frame for measuring that? Related to that also, how could this issue be made more visible and transparent in public and policy discussions around sustainability? Because I'm sure that the kind of arguments that you make, if there were more publicly aired information about that, would become more publicly available. That would create more pressure to act, not just symbolically, but with real impact. And the second question that I have is in relation to your framework of measuring success of orchestration. I would like to understand better, how do you define success of orchestration? Thank you.
Perhaps you can answer now, Stefano.
Yes. Am I on with the, yeah, okay. Great questions. Thank you. Thank you so much, all three of you. So Edwin, this is a very interesting turn in the way in which sustainability is being portrayed to consumers and to the public in general. I find this particular turn particularly problematic for exactly the reasons that you mentioned. First of all, consumers are buying things mostly on impulse. Secondly, even if they look at the labels, there are so many labels on everything now that it's very easy to get confused. Number three, despite the fact that you may hear arguments and discourses by, say, the supermarket buyers that the consumers are queen and kings, it is actually a relatively small number of purchasing officers that make the decisions on how and when to buy certain products and how they're going to measure their sustainability and what kind of certifications, if any, they're going to require. Of course, that good and product has to be able to sell. So if it doesn't sell, then you pull it anyway. But there is a little too much faith on quote the consumer from that perspective. If I were to be proposed voted by consumer as most sustainable, I would say this is close to pure manipulation. Because to begin with, the consumer, as you said, it has very little way in which to assess sustainability. Sustainability itself can be assessed in many different ways. The social and environmental part, there's so many different layers. So I would see this as essentially a sign of failure of truly addressing sustainability in other ways, or failure to even purchase products that at the very least have some form of certification, that has some form of independent verification system. So it is very troubling. I haven't seen that in Scandinavia yet, but I'm sure that if the Dutch are doing it, usually the Scandinavians, are following the Brits and the Dutch, usually after a few years and usually too late, but that's another story. That is also in academia, by the way. Anyway, so that's one. Marcus, point out industries where the orchestration of sustainability has not been achieved, but not inflicting damage or asking for more to farmers or producers in the global south. I'm pretty sure that these examples are there, are out there. I still in the cases in the industries that I've been looking at, in the countries that I work, so mostly East Africa, South Africa, Southeast Asia, a bit in Latin America. I'm not convinced that I've seen that. There may be some good signs coming out of efforts in other industries, especially in labor-intensive industries, where the efficiency gains of green factories or to produce more sustainably have overcome the extra costs, at least in the midterm. So there are examples coming out of Sri Lanka or other places in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, on the clothing industry of that sort. If you look at it at the individual level, at the factory level. Now, the problem is in evolutionary terms, what the green factories were able to do, say in Sri Lanka 10 years ago with Marks and Spencer, now most of the producers in the region apply more or less the same environmental practices, which is good, okay? And there are some good signs in terms of, especially in terms of labor safety, right? Work safety, I mean. But the prices that they're getting for delivering better, more sustainable garments are getting lower because the competition is so high and the buyers are so few. And so, unfortunately, I don't have overall, a lot of faith in that. Essentially, what is happening is that one or another aspect of sustainability are becoming part of a package of quality traits from these goods that need to be delivered to be able to be considered. So it's not even a factor of differentiation and therefore of value addition, but it is essential to put your foot on the door with a big fight. Maria, you have 3 questions and they're all very hard, but I'll try to start unpacking. All the questions were very good. So thank you for letting me know about this project. I think it's very interesting. I think there's a lot of very interesting stuff going on with forestry because of the legal verification systems that are coming up that the EU is asking export countries to put in place. So it's a relatively new and very very innovative way of regulating / orchestrating. Now, the measuring the environmental impacts at the empirical level is very specific, as you well know. So depending on the range of the research objectives at play, for example, in the book for aviation and shipping, I chose to just measure GHG emissions and see what kind of trends were taking place and what the international organizations wanted to do in terms of applying change, right? And in both cases, the international organizations weren't doing much. They weren't interested in changing anything because they were in the hands of particular groups in the industry that were blocking everything, even though within each of the international organizations, there were more progressive groups that of countries in particular that wanted to have change. Now, is that the best way? The only way, no. The best way, probably. But saying shipping, there are at least, I can think of another 4, 5, 6 really important indicators that need to be looked at the same time. So we're doing some work just on shipping and then looking at orchestration. And we published a few papers now. Jane Lister and Renee Paulson are involved in this work. And if you're interested in that, you can look it up. The same with aviation, essentially. When it comes to agri-food products, it's very complicated. There's a lot of research on coffee. You can this is like a mountain of work that is looking at deforestation, biodiversity, soil, forest cover, et cetera, et cetera. So huge literature, also with very big literature reviews that show a mixed record. There is some good stories in there, especially when it comes to shade. But a lot of other stories that are much more sort of complex. In the opposite in wine, in the wine industry, I worked in South Africa in the past. I'm going back actually next year for a follow-up study, and there's very little that we know in terms of the impact, say, of integrated pest management on biodiversity, whether biodynamic and organic agriculture is making any change. And huge debate about biodiversity because, okay, you can still maintain biodiversity in the areas that are buffering a vineyard, but if you are cutting down or moving from different kinds of cultivation into vineyard, a vineyard is essentially monoculture. And therefore, yes, you can actually maintain some biodiversity, but at a macro level, you actually change. I mean, I'm working in some areas in Italy, for example, that used to be very biodiverse, and now you only have viticulture because everybody wants Prosecco. And so everybody's planting the Glera vine that gives them Prosecco. So everybody's drinking Prosecco. It's great. It's a great story, but it's also a great story of environmental disaster in the waiting. And I'm actually still working on this. And so the issue of visibility and transparency, I'm not sure we have a lot of time for this, but I tried to develop some of those ideas in the table that I briefly showed you. And the story again is there isn't one way of doing that. And it really depends on what kind of actual visibility there is, what kind of visibility is needed for any change to take place, and whether actually in some cases, instead of trying to enhance visibility, you would just work with a regulatory framework, a bit of what happened in the biofuel sector. In other sectors, there are very, very different ways of doing that. And I know this answer is not something that is very precise for the question you have. But I really don't want to come out with like some generic statement because I mean, in the book, I think there are a couple of examples that tell you exactly how one could or could not enhance visibility and when that should take place or when it's not needed. So if you look back at the biofuel slide on enhanced visibility, I'm like, doesn't matter really. there are other things that are being done and can be done. I think I'm going to stop here for now. I haven't answered all the questions, but hopefully enough of them.
I know some people have to leave, but I'd like to keep and continue for a few more minutes. And if other people do not have questions, I'd like to go on and to ask you about the decision to focus on 4 forms of power. And why didn't you, for example, work in terms of the first dimension, second dimension, third dimension of power, or alternatively, more instrumental forms versus structural forms of power relations? And so this is one question. And after you will answer, I will ask you to also to do a short presentation of the book just for audience that would like to consider the biggest recording. So let's start with the power, the decision to focus on those 4 forms of power.
So we worked on that particular paper that then became the analytical framework for the book for several years. And it started with Mark Dollars and a couple of pieces that he had developed for, one is in economic society and the other one world development on diffuse forms of power. And then so we did a huge sort of literature review in the social sciences on different forms of power and all the debate on first, second, third, and fourth dimensions of power. We decided to kind of step away from that because a lot of the elements of instrumental versus structural focus, discursive versus material sort of approaches are actually embedded into the 4 kinds. We just don't divide them up in that particular way because we found that the existing categorizations made it very difficult then to pinpoint empirically what was what. And so, it took us 2 R&Rs and, also 2 of the reviewers were specialists on power. And we made peace with the idea, and they made peace with the idea that this categorization was really about sort of global value chains and their governance. It's not about sort of power and economic activity more generally. And that we convinced them eventually that a lot of these elements are embedded into the different kinds. And the article actually goes very detailed ways in saying, well, these various aspects of power, we can actually, if you step away from that and you take in the same considerations and you look at the various forms, then you find elements in that.
So let me say thank you very much for fascinating talk and really rich agenda for research, which connects so many kinds of literature. It's really broad and innovative. So thank you very much. Stefano, do you want to say a last word before we finish, Stefano?
Thank you for the invitation, David, and thanks everyone for the great questions, for the invitation.